Have a listen.
Welcome to Heritage Explains. I'm Victoria Coates, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome my twice former colleague, both in Senator Cruz's office and at the American Foreign Policy Council, Michael Sobolik. He is a senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific at AFPC, and he is the author of the just-published Countering China's Great Game, A Strategy for American Dominance. Michael, congratulations on your book.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for the kind words, Victoria.
Absolutely. And I always ask this question first, and I think I might already know the answer, but why did you write this book, and why now?
So I spent, as you know very well, 5 years in the Senate working for our former boss, Senator Cruz from Texas. And I recall there was one day where I had some dinner event that I was asked to present on the Senate's broader China legislation that was going through the chamber. And I took stock of all the China bills that were going through, and I noticed that they fell into one of two policy buckets. The bucket number one that the Senate was really focusing on between, say, 2017 to 2019 was China has infiltrated the United States in so many different ways with its malign influence, from Confucius Institutes to IP theft and so many others, and we have to find a way to insulate ourselves from that. The second bucket was realizing this, oh my goodness, so many American companies are complicit in human rights abuses inside of China just in the course of normal legal business investments. So a lot of legislation was dealing in these two issues, but there was a third bucket that I realized was really unaddressed on the Hill, and it was this problem of what are we going to do to mess with Beijing, and more specifically, what are problems that we are creating for our competitor for them to respond to? And that realization that a lot of our China policy on Capitol Hill was reacting to problems that the Chinese Communist Party had created for America over 3.5 decades of engagement, there wasn't that much offensive action either in the Congress or certainly with the Obama administration against the Chinese Communist Party. And that was a huge motivator to try to figure out a vision for going on the offense.
Excellent. And I wanted to sort of dive right in on Chapter 1, Imperialism Strikes Back. You addressed the protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and that, to my historical eye, has emerged as the moment when China concluded it could go not in the path that everyone in the West was hoping it would go in terms of increasing economic engagement leading to political liberalization and joining the world order and generally behaving like a normal country, but that they didn't have to do that. That the West was willing to look aside, even with the most flagrant human rights abuses, in order to keep the economic cooperation going. And so I just wanted to ask you what your views are on Tiananmen as a pivot point, and how China has, as we're now 30 plus years out from that, how they view that incident and how it has shaped their policy.
So one of the pieces of advice I got when I was writing this book was it's helpful to write angry sometimes because it just helps you write with more clarity. And I was angry writing this part of the book about Tiananmen Square because I came across a factoid that I did not know previously, that the security cameras in Beijing that allowed the Chinese Communist Party to identify the student protesters that they didn't maul and destroy with the tanks at first, those were American and British security cameras. And then maybe 6 or 7 years later, when the whole world decided to forgive the regime for Tiananmen Square and the investment from not just companies, but from multilateral development organizations started to flow back in, you had the World Bank subsidizing those same cameras in Tibet in 1996. And it was this collective desire on the part of so many democracies in the United Nations and the World Bank and so many others that it must be true that history has ended. It must be true that democracy is this inevitable siren song, even for a regime as authoritarian as the CCP. And it was a willing decision to ignore reality. And at the time, when George H.W. Bush was responding to Tiananmen Square, like, keep in mind, this is the exact same year the Berlin Wall came down. And a few months earlier in Tiananmen Square, the party was cracking down on Chinese protesters with the assistance of Western technology. Like, we were building the Great Firewall on one hand and tearing down the Berlin Wall on the other. And as I wrote this book, I found myself asking why, because it's so peculiar. And I think that the United States was drunk on one of our biggest foreign policy successes. Like, if you win a Cold War without firing a shot, it's easy for that to go to your head. And I think it did. And over time, I think you asked how the party views Tiananmen Square. They're deathly afraid of its memory. It is still a heavily censored topic of conversation. I remember when Taylor Swift's 1989 album came out, because I think it came out on June 4th or something, and it was obviously called 1989. And the party was deathly afraid of Taylor Swift at that time, which is hilarious, but also really illustrative of who the party is. And I think Tiananmen Square is one of those original sin moments of America's China policy. And it is one that we still have not fully exorcised from our past.
No, I agree. And they also seem deathly afraid of Barbie. So maybe we're onto something with pop culture.
Maybe so.
And the other issue, particularly around human rights, that I wanted to get your views on was Dr. Liu, the case that we worked on from the Senate, sort of what the ramifications were of that activity, and seeing how legislation can sometimes be helpful in advancing a human rights agenda.
Yes. I have so much fun telling this story of what Senator Cruz did for Dr. Liu Xiaobo and his wife Liu Jia, because I think it's the best example I've ever come across of how standing for human rights is not it is not just the morally right thing to do. It is the strategically savvy thing to do. I will never not find it hilarious that this became a top 3 legislative priority for the PRC embassy and for their UN mission in New York. I was up in New York. I was about to fly out to Israel for a week-long event, I think in 2017. And I was able to snag a meeting with someone at the United Nations the day before we left. And I sat down with him, and he said, this is like one of the biggest things they canvass up here, right? And I had no idea at the time. And for the listeners who don't know what we're talking about, the bill that Senator Cruz introduced and advanced was so simple. It literally changed the street that the Chinese embassy resides on in Washington, D.C. to Liu Xiaobo Plaza. So every single piece of mail that the Chinese embassy would receive in D.C. would have the name of this Nobel Prize winning political dissident that they had tried to silence for decades. And Senator Cruz modeled this over a legislative play that Senator Grassley did during the prior Cold War with Andrei Sakharov in the Soviet embassy. And when you force authoritarian regimes to confront their tyrannical behavior in ways that they try to conceal, it puts them not only in an uncomfortable position globally, it exposes how afraid they are of their own people inside of their own borders. And this is, I think, a mistake that is easy for Americans and maybe just Western democratically minded peoples to make, because we see the capability that these authoritarians have, that, oh my goodness, they have the ability to shut down discourse on the internet. They have the ability to find anyone they want to find and silence them. We saw this during the early days of the COVID-19 virus, when they tracked down doctors who were telling the truth about the virus in China and completely silenced them. It's impressive that they can do that, but it also is a sign of weakness and fear. Like, secure governments do not feel the need to do this, or they should not feel the need to do this ever. And the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is so afraid of truth tellers, especially of Chinese truth tellers inside of China, that's a source of strategic leverage for the United States. And Senator Cruz, to his great credit, not only introduced the bill, he fought tooth and nail for it, to the point that Beijing was sending unofficial, like, track 1.5 meetings to his office to meet with us, to try to convince us, to ultimately him, to back off the legislation. And it was a lie. They said, just be quiet and maybe we can figure this out. And of course, Senator Cruz has never been good about being quiet about tyranny. And to his credit, and in large part because of him, they let Liu Jia leave China. And it was a huge, huge success.
Well, describe what happened when after Dr. Liu died, basically at the hands of neglect of the CCP. How was that leverage exercised?
Oh, yeah. So their hope was after Liu Xiaobo died that Senator Cruz would give up on the bill. And he didn't, because as we just said, he left behind a wife. And I remember our old boss talking about a meeting he had with then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at the State Department. And the former Secretary of State told Senator Cruz, like, they are breathing down my neck on this bill. And what the senator said was, okay, fine, I'll make a deal. They let Liu Jia leave and I will drop the bill. I won't even advance it anymore. I won't bring it up again. I won't reintroduce it. All they need to do is let her go. And he tried, I don't know how many times he tried to pass this bill on the Senate floor by unanimous consent, but he tried several times, at least 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. And every single time it was either opposition from a former California senator, or we also had some issues on the Republican side of the aisle behind the scenes. So he was catching flack from both ends on this. And I remember one time in the cloakroom when he found out that there was going to be another objection. And this is just one of those moments that when you're privileged to work in government, you get to see people when there isn't a camera on them. And it was always evident, I think, to us who worked on this, how much it meant to him. And he never gave up. And they asked us every which way to back down. And his insistence on shining the light on it eventually, I think, forced their hand, in cooperation with the Trump administration, finally to let her go. And they did.
Now, it's an excellent example of how a strong human rights agenda, focused on specific cases, can advance American interests.
Yes.
And so hopefully we will be doing more such work with the Pillar of Shame later on this year. That will be the topic of another podcast. Moving on to China's global posture, it's fashionable in some corners of Washington right now to suggest that because China is the preeminent national security challenge to the United States on so many levels, economic, cultural, military, all of these come into play that, and at the Heritage Foundation, we strongly agree with that assessment, but that for that reason, we need to be primarily focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And as much as we like you, Michael, and want to give you lots of material to work on, what's clear to me is China is not confining their activities to the Indo-Pacific region. And recently, after the testimony of the SOCOM, the Southern Command head, that the largest CCP embassy in the world is actually in the Bahamas, in Nassau, 120 nautical miles from Miami in the Atlantic. The inability, we are not able at this point to confine China to the Indo-Pacific. So if we focus exclusively on the Indo-Pacific, I think we're going to be in trouble. So I was struck in your discussion in Chapter 3 about Europe and how Europe plays into this as another major economic market, a collective economy that's roughly the size of the United States, so in a way, a peer economically of China and the United States, which has a very conflicted relationship with China because the United States needs access to the European market. They're one of our largest partners that could expand. But how is China seeing Europe? And how dependent do you think Europe is on China?
Europe, in many ways, is the strategic crown jewel of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. The whole purpose of China's foreign policy right now is to rejigger not only the economic orientation, but the strategic orientation of the key regions of the world away from Washington and toward Beijing. They're doing that in a whole host of ways, which we can get into, but at a really high level, that's what they're trying to achieve. And when you look at Europe, one of the reasons Europe matters so much to Beijing is because they know that one of the biggest reasons the United States and the West won the Cold War, the first Cold War against the Soviet Union, is because of that transatlantic link of unity. Sure, like it wasn't, I'm not saying that we were always on the same page the whole time. I may not have been alive during that time, but I've read enough to know that we weren't. But that history, I think, has been studied extensively in Beijing because Xi Jinping knows that he is in a Cold War with the United States today. And he also knows that it is more than just economic, although it's a huge part of it, which we'll get into. It's also ideological. It's also civilizational in a lot of ways. And he knows that those links are strong between the United States and Europe in a lot of ways. And if he can, at least at the material level with economics, pull Western Europe in particular, like they've been really successful in different parts of Eastern Europe. Western Europe, though, is, as we all know, where the decision-making and the power in the EU lies. And if Xi Jinping can win over Western Europe enough on the margin to get them to not behave as if they are in a Cold War with China, then that's going to make his global campaign much easier. And I would venture to say that China has been pretty successful in Europe. The biggest example I bring up in Chapter 3, which you mention, is in the previous century, Europe was the epicenter of perhaps the worst genocide we have ever known. We collectively call it the Holocaust. There is another genocide happening today inside of China, targeting primarily the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And if you look at the stance of the Europeans about this, they've largely been silent about it. And one of the biggest reasons is because of talk about Germany, where the Holocaust was directed. The Germans are hopelessly leaning on their relationship with China with economics first and everything else second. And I would say President Macron in France is sadly doing the same thing. And both of them have this deep desire for the sake of their own national companies to access the Chinese market for the benefit of their consumers, which I get it, makes sense. But the deal with the devil in that is you have to be quiet about a lot of other things because the access to China's market has a whole lot of political strings attached. Human rights being a big one of them, silence on human rights being a big one of them. And at least right now, Europe is making that deal. And it's putting them in a diplomatic position where they are very hesitant and very afraid to say anything confrontational because of the economic component.
Yeah, and I'm deeply concerned about this because, one of the projects we're focused on is trying to get our European partners and allies, particularly those in NATO, to take a more forward-leaning, aggressive stance on their defense. And we see this as a national security issue on everything from solar panels to, you name it. And so given the fact that the United States has obligations in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific that the NATO partners don't necessarily share, we need them to be at the forefront. And so how you balance engaged, supportive U.S. posture with not over-reassuring them so they just assume we're always going to be there to bail them out and they don't have to make these hard decisions. I'm quite concerned something similar to that is emerging with China. And along those lines, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Belt and Road, particularly in terms of how China is using predatory investments the debt traps, so-called, that you mention on page 86 of Chapter 4, that how are they using that in the developing world to advance their interests, and why isn't the United States doing more to counter it?
Belt and Road, as you mentioned, is not a regional policy. It's a global phenomenon. And I think one of the most shocking things about the BRI that I came across writing this book was you previously mentioned Latin America. And in the course of writing that portion of Chapter 3, it shocked me when I learned that they're essentially trying to do what the Kaiser tried to do in World War I and what Hitler tried to do in World War II and what the Soviets tried to do during the Cold War, which is to infiltrate our own hemisphere and to limit our own ability to exert our own strategic influence in our near abroad. That is absolutely what China is trying to do. Now, you mentioned the Bahamas. If you go further south, you see them doing the same thing in Argentina with very sensitive space bases there that they have a multi-year lease on that even the Argentine government has trouble getting access to because of the agreement. You look at what they're doing in the Pacific Islands, that's not just them trying to isolate Taiwan, although that's a huge part of it. They are trying to break into the near abroad for Guam and Hawaii. They are they're an expansive power, and they're not just expanding where it's easy for them. They are challenging the United States at every single turn. And one of the ways they do this is with predatory economics. And this is one of the really challenging parts of the Belt and Road and the American response to it, or maybe the lack of American response to it, because what China is doing is going into the global south and offering below market loans for infrastructure. And they're happy to undercut Western companies, whether it be a Japanese company or American company or Australian company or a French company or what have you, because they don't care ultimately about turning a profit. This is one of the strategic benefits that Xi Jinping has against us in this. I had a conversation with a Central Asian embassy last year about this, and I asked the question, how are we doing with countering the Belt and Road in your neighborhood? And he said, well, we got two interest rate offers, one from you guys, one from China. The U.S. interest rate was 14% and the Chinese interest rate was 2%. So that is an insurmountable delta between those two interest rates. It's not that America hasn't tried, because under the Trump administration, we had the Blue Dot Network with the Japanese and the Australians to try to help countries better assess the quality of the loans that China was offering them. We pulled some resources with those same countries to try to do good faith effort to have an alternative. Nothing has worked. Biden's Build Back Better World thing has been a bust. Nothing has come from it. And this is, whenever I talk to college students, this is the unanswered question about the Belt and Road. How do we offer an at-cost alternative? I have not seen a compelling answer from anyone. The reason I don't give one in the book is because this is an offensive sabotage their own policies, basically. But in that reactive category, we have to find an answer to this. I haven't seen a good one yet.
No, and I think that is an excellent question for any candidate for president. We now have pretty clearly our two, but I think answering that will be critically important. Now, in that answer, you mentioned another sort of magic word here in Washington, which is Taiwan. And last question before we get to the conclusion of the book, what are your views on Taiwan? How does Taiwan play into the great game? And what should the United States be doing vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Xi Jinping has made it abundantly clear that he wants to be the great statesman in China that solves the Taiwan problem. And from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, they have a sovereignty problem. And we would not agree with that. But their perspective is that the People's Republic of China is rent asunder because Taiwan, from their perspective, is a renegade province. So they view Taiwan not as a war of offense, but as a war of liberation, which is a really chilling framing, but that is how they describe it. And Taiwan, for the United States, is more than just an island 8,000 miles away and a couple hundred miles off of China's coast, although it's easy to think of it that way. If your starting point is that we're in a Cold War, and that is my starting point, I know that's the starting point of a lot of folks at the Heritage Foundation as well. You guys have literally published a huge report about China policy about us being in a Cold War with them. Taiwan is the first primary point of military skirmish in this Cold War. Maybe the South China Sea. I could see that happening pretty easily, but Taiwan is the crown jewel for the PRC. And if they try to go to war over Taiwan and lose, that implicates not just Xi Jinping's influence, it could implicate his life, certainly his role. Like, Chinese politics is a dangerous game to play. But Taiwan matters for the United States, not just because they're a fellow democracy. It matters technologically with the semiconductors that are produced there that undergird daily technological life in ways we take for granted. It matters also geopolitically, as I argue in the book, and I think this is so underappreciated. They will not stop at Taiwan. I do not think we appreciate China as an imperial power like we should. If you sit yourself in China and turn around in a circle, they have border issues in every single direction. And if they get the momentum with Taiwan, they're not only hoping that they can stave off some of their medium to long-term demographic and economic problems, they will have the wind at their backs because the credibility of the United States in a huge way is going to be an open question. No, we haven't promised to defend Taiwan legally in a treaty. We haven't done that since like the 70s. But what we have strongly implicated is that we have an abiding interest in cross-strait stability. And if we allow that stability to divert into chaos, and if Taiwan falls, we don't want to live in that world. Not only for security reasons, but the world will get increasingly expensive for the American consumer as the world gets more dangerous. The more we can get ahead of these problems, the better for everyone. And I don't know how this is going to play out, but we've got to make sure it never comes to that, where Xi Jinping gives the go order.
We strongly agree. And I wanted to end on a more hopeful note. There's a lot in this book that's very sobering. As you say, it makes you angry that we have allowed this situation to develop. But just in that answer, you did mention a couple of things that I've been very taken with, the demographic and economic problems that China has. And what you said at the beginning of, why aren't we doing everything we can every day in ways big and small to make those problems worse? Because, what you lay out is that the rise of China is in no way inevitable in the end. As much progress as they've made, and your subtitle is a strategy for American dominance. So you're still hopeful that that's possible.
If the United States decides to win this Cold War, I think we will. It will require clear, courageous presidential leadership for us to take that posture. It's going to require bipartisan buy-in on Capitol Hill, which, because of what happened with TikTok recently, I am hopeful that we still have the potential to build something like that. But the way that we win this Cold War, not only with a posture, but practically, if our starting point is what are the Chinese Communist Party's weaknesses and how do we force them to compete on that terrain, I can think of worse ways to wage a Cold War. And practically, I think we should start maybe with information. So we started talking about how terrified the party is of their own people. They're also afraid of the speech of their own people. And when China censors political discussion and discourse inside of their own borders, that's not just an internal human rights thing. Americans died because the party cared more about stopping information about the coronavirus than they cared about stopping the virus itself. So this is a national security issue. And I had your old colleague, Matt Pottinger, on my podcast maybe a year and a half ago to talk about China and information and the Great Firewall. And I asked him, when you were serving in government as Deputy National Security Advisor, were we doing anything at all to complicate China's ability to censor and control information inside of China? And he said, nope, not really. And to me, this is such leverage that we're leaving on the table. I mean, forget about the Belt and Road around the world. I get into that in Chapter 5 about how we can take on the Belt and Road globally head on. But Chapter 6, to me, is the crux of it, because the Belt and Road has roots that trace back to China. Like the Digital Silk Road is an authoritarian censorship package in a box. And that was honed and perfected inside of China. And if we are going to win the Cold War, like the first one, information is going to be a huge part of it. It's not going to be over the radio, like Radio Free Asia, although it's still going to have its marginal importance. We are going to need to make it more expensive and more costly for our adversary to dominate political discourse inside of its own borders. They say that's crossing a red line. I say let's test it. They've been testing our red lines in the South China Sea for over a decade, and we have done next to nothing until it was too late to do anything about it. If we start to test their red lines, not only will we learn about them, we're competing on terrain they don't want us to compete on. That is how we gain the momentum and how we gain the advantage in the long run in the Cold War. And hopefully, the things you mentioned with the demographics and the economics, it's not good for them in the long run. If we can complicate the next 10 years for them, this window of opportunity that they have, and make sure they cannot seize it, they're going to be in an increasingly difficult position.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, not surprisingly. But, I think the information space is critical. Free speech should be our brand as the United States, and we should export it. So, Michael, I can't believe the half an hour is over already. We could talk to you all day about this book. There's so much more in it for all of our heritage listeners. Strongly commend Countering China's Great Game, a strategy for American dominance, to all of you who are interested in China. And we're recording in April, but coming up next month at Heritage, we will be both revealing Pillar 1 of our Chinese Handcuffs project about China and domination of the green energy sector, and then also the bipartisan COVID-19 report on the origins of the virus in China. So we hope very much that you'll be joining us here at Heritage for both those events and those important discussions. And thank you again.
Thanks so much, Victoria. It's a pleasure.
Thank you to Victoria Coates and Michael Sobolik for their contributions to this episode of Heritage Explains. You can follow them both on X, and you can find a link to Michael's book, Countering China's Great Game, a Strategy for American Dominance, in the show notes. And thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. If you have any thoughts or feedback for us, we look forward to hearing from you, and you can reach